Hello friends, my name is JJ, and the other day I was at the thrift store, wasting money buying books I will never read, as one does, and I came across this delightful fella, The People's Almanac #2, published in 1978. And I just had to buy it, given I am already the proud owner of the People's Almanac #1. You see, The People's Almanac is a nerdy novelty book of a sort that was very popular in the pre-internet age. It is definitely the sort of book that I was very fond of when I was young, and the internet was still just a gleam in Al Gore's eye. It's a big collection of all sorts of random facts you can browse at your leisure. Facts like uncommon stories behind common words, a guide to buried treasure in North America, a history of the toilet, 4 matadors who died bizarre deaths. In other words, the sorts of things that people like me now make YouTube videos about. And on that note, I was inspired to make a video about one of this book's more interesting chapters, predicting the future. Basically, what the People's Almanac editors did was gather up a bunch of men and women who claimed to be good at predicting the future and wrote down a bunch of their claims about what they thought the world would be like in the 1980s and beyond. Specifically, they got 10 psychics, 19 guys described as modern scientists, and 8 science fiction authors, both living and dead. And since it has now been a staggering 45 years since this book was published, I thought it might be fun to see how some of these predictions have held up. Spoiler alert, not very well. So I'll just come out and say it, pretty much none of these guys predicted the future very well at all. In fact, what is most interesting is that the psychics, who I think we can all agree are basically just yanking stuff out of their backsides, were only slightly worse at predicting the future than the scientists. But regardless of who they were, the vast majority of the predictors got the vast majority of their predictions wrong. Though I should say that the scientists were the group most likely to get at least a few things right. The science fiction writers, however, were the most wrong. Pretty much none of them came close to even making a single accurate prediction about anything in the post-1978 world. Though I should note that the People's Almanac people also pulled these predictions from the writer's novels, which may or may not be fair, since how a writer portrays the future in a story is not necessarily reflective of what he thinks is actually going to happen. But it's still something worth keeping in mind, just given how many people run around these days saying, "It's like we're living in science fiction." The only slightly impressive predictions from this set were James Blish predicted there would be a space station. The late Hugo Gernsback predicted we would have temperature-controlled couches, a world population around 6 billion, and voice-controlled lights. Joe Haldeman said that fake coffee would be a thing, and that pot would become more popular than tobacco, though he also thought the small amounts of tobacco still in circulation would be imported from the moon. And the late H.G. Wells predicted we would have wall-sized TVs, and that printed books would be replaced by video cassettes which tell stories, which I guess is kinda true if you squint a bit. But to get to these few nuggets of truth, you have to wade through a lot of crap, including predictions such as schools of the future will teach children through hypnotic instruction while they sleep, human intelligence will be increased through brain implants, Mars will be used as a penal colony, much like Australia in the 19th century, and the government will officially encourage homosexuality for birth control purposes. Although I guess that's basically what Ben Shapiro believes, right? But now let's put the sci-fi guys aside and talk about what the scientists and psychics thought was going to happen, because their predictions are far more precise and explicit. One thing that is interesting about the psychics, but perhaps not entirely unpredictable, is how many of them predicted that psychics themselves would play a bigger role in the world of tomorrow. This included predictions that psychics will run radionics devices and PSI generators at police departments, defense plants, and other government facilities. Psychics will be used for espionage. They will also be accepted as expert witnesses in courtrooms. And astrologers will continue to gain popularity. Hundreds of people will turn to them in the future for birth control advice. Now, by my count, the most accurate of the 10 psychics they polled was a woman named Kathy Sotka, who I gave a score of 3 out of 13 in terms of her ratio of accurate to inaccurate predictions. She said that by 1979, there will be a force of evil building up in North Korea. Watch for a reign of terror culminating in riots and political assassinations. And that is, of course, more or less what happened, but I don't know if she was really going out that much on a limb. I think the wickedness of the North Korean dictatorship was already pretty obvious by the mid-1970s, but by psychic standards, this is still impressively accurate. Kathy also said that the health of Egyptian President Anwar Sadat would steadily decline, and he will be unable to perform political duties after 1980, which is true in the sense that shortly after she made that prediction, he was shot to death with a machine gun. Talking of guns, Kathy likewise predicted that in the near future, guns as we presently know them will be replaced by hand weapons that stun or kill by emitting an electrical charge instead of bullets, which did kinda sorta predict tasers, though we obviously still have bullet guns as well. How come tasers aren't more popular as weapons? They can be just as lethal, right? One of the single best psychic premonitions, however, came from Maris DeLong, who predicted that Jimmy Carter, who was at the time America's very unpopular and beleaguered president, would prove to be the most beloved American leader of the 20th century due to his commitment to human rights. And I think you can make a strong argument that this was indeed the case, given he eventually won the Nobel Peace Prize and has enjoyed a mostly glowing post-presidential reputation. But Maris also thought he would be reelected in 1980, so let's not give her too much credit. I think that my most favorite accurate psychic prediction, however, is also one of the weirdest and most narrowly specific. It comes from a woman named Jandolyn Marks, who says, airlines will limit the amount of insurance passengers can receive in the event of fatal disasters. Insurance vending machines now found at most major airports will become collector's items. Now, this is something that I wasn't even aware was a thing until I read this. Apparently, well, up until the 1980s or so, people honestly thought that flying in airplanes was so dangerous they would buy life insurance before every trip to protect their families, just in case. And the airports happily provided this service in the form of insurance vending machines, which, although not exactly a popular collector's item today, are certainly seen as weird and quaint things from another time that you might expect to find in a museum or something. I did, however, spot at least some airport insurance paraphernalia being sold on eBay. Jandolyn's specific prediction seems to imply that the death of these machines will come as a result of pressure from the airlines. But in reality, it was more that the public at some point just realized that air travel is actually quite safe, coupled with the fact that a lot more people these days have general life insurance than they used to. All right, so I know you guys want to hear some of the overwhelmingly wrong things that the psychics predicted, so let's get to those. The psychic Daniel Logan predicted that in the next few years, the US presidency would be abolished and replaced with 5 executive leaders. He also said that by 2000, New York City will no longer exist. Gene Dixon, meanwhile, said that the papacy would be abolished. And perhaps on a related note, in 2020, the Antichrist will be revealed as evil, the Battle of Armageddon involving millions will take place, and the forces of good will win. Must have missed that one. I give Irene Hughes credit for her mostly accurate prediction that by 1981, China will be in a great internal revolution, Mao's ideas will be thrown out and considered disgraceful, a new leader will take over. Which does more or less accurately describe the ascension of Deng Xiaoping, China's famously reformist leader during the 1980s. But Irene also predicted that there would be some sort of war in Switzerland, ruining its reputation as the peace capital of the world. Also, there would be bloodshed on the moon after things go wrong with the Russian nuclear tests she expected would be happening there. Tenny Hale, who the book identifies as Oregon's top-rated psychic, says that new uses of DNA will lead to numerous medical cures, but also to a great many mutations similar to the strange creatures in old mythology. Now, before you go off on Tenny, I will just say that her prediction is actually quite similar to one offered by one of the scientists, James Daniele of the State University of New York at Buffalo, who says in the near future, it might be possible with cell transplants to create a creature that would be part horse, part man. I can't see any reason for doing it, mind you, he graciously adds. So what else did the scientists get wrong? Well, we got Merton Davies of the RAND Corporation saying that by the year 2000, all of the surfaces of the major planets and satellites will have been initially explored and mapped, and the first permanent lunar base will be operational by 2000, as well as the first manned landing on Mars may well take place before 2010, and the first city by 2060. I guess we can Give him a break on that last one. Glenn T. Seaborg of the University of California, Berkeley, who won the 1951 Nobel Prize in Chemistry, also predicted manned travel to Mars, as well as colonization of the moon, plus a rather optimistic prediction that computer-aided molecular medicine, immunochemistry, and chemotherapy should lead to the alleviation, treatment, cure, or prevention of our major ailments, including mental illness and a slowing of the aging process. I like how he put mental illness in quotation marks. It was such a new idea, and yet he was already convinced we were going to cure it. But let's not overlook the things that the scientists got shockingly right. 3 of the 19 scientists predicted that we would have pocket telephones in the 21st century, with the Soviet professor Vladimir Alexandrovich Kotelnikov offering the most on-the-nose prediction of all, claiming that in the 21st century, miniature television sets the size of cigarette holders will be used as everyday video phones. The creation of an artificial heart was also predicted by a few of the scientists, which indeed happened in 1982, as well as the creation of more synthetic foods, including plant-based proteins capable of replacing meat. Dr. Herman Kahn, who was one of the most famous public intellectuals of his time, offers a whole boatload of predictions, some of which were quite accurate, including a practical method of extracting oil from shale and practical ways of desalinizing seawater, and some of which were super not, including Italy, Portugal, and Spain becoming richer than England, and robot slaves. So, is there a lesson to be learned from all of this? Well, there is certainly no shortage of people willing to predict the future these days, and they are often every bit as cocksure as the people in this book. And whether it's how AI is going to render all jobs obsolete, or how America will become a fascist dictatorship, or how entire countries will soon be underwater due to global warming, a lot of the predictions you hear today are based around assumptions that current trends will continue to accelerate exponentially. And this was very much the case with a lot of the predictions made in 1978 as well. Whether the predictors were psychics or scientists or writers, most of their predictions were based around taking exciting or troubling trends from the 1970s and accelerating them in a way that felt plausible at the time. For example, as I'm sure you noticed, a lot of the predictions involved outer space. It was by far the most common theme of predictions made by all 3 categories of predictor. And this was because they were all offering their predictions in the context of a world where there had been multiple manned missions to the moon over the last few years, so it seemed logical to assume that things would continue in that direction, and that throughout the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, we would proceed to build moon cities and visit other planets and all the rest. But in reality, as we all know, we just abruptly stopped visiting the moon after the 1970s for a whole host of complicated reasons, and space exploration in general has come to be seen as a lot less relevant to human interests than it did 45 years ago. The second most common theme of predictions is something that might surprise you a bit, and that is solar power. There were a ton of predictions of everything being run by solar power by the 21st century, and this makes sense when you consider that practical solar panels had only been recently invented, with the first solar-powered building being unveiled in 1972. President Carter even installed solar panels on the roof of the White House when he moved in. The 1970s had also seen a terrible oil shortage in much of the world, resulting from turmoil in the Middle East, and this made a lot of people assume that oil was this fundamentally unstable, dangerously limited resource that the world would have no choice but to wean ourselves off of. This is also why dreams of electric cars or car alternatives feature so prominently in these predictions as well. But in reality, since the 1970s, we have learned that the world actually has a lot more oil than we previously realized, and we are still using as much as ever, for better or worse. Dreams about a cure for cancer come up a lot as well, which also makes sense when you consider that the cancer death rate had been going up and up and up over the last few decades, making it really seem like the most pressing health issue of the time. Cancer is still obviously a major cause of death today, but contemporary improvements in chemotherapy and drugs and prevention have also greatly lowered its mortality rate, and this has accordingly lessened how large it looms in our collective imagination. When we look at all of the big, important societal changes that these guys did not predict, by contrast, they tend to involve issues that were less front of mind in the 1970s. Stuff like LGBT rights, CO2-related climate change, the fall of the USSR, video games, and of course, the internet. In retrospect, we can see signs of all of these things rising during the 1970s, but they were subtle signs that got a lot less media attention than this stuff. So it's just something to keep in mind the next time you hear some guy beacon off about what the world in 2050 or whatever is going to be like. It seems entirely possible that some of the most dramatic changes are coming in areas where we don't expect them, while some of the things we think are going to change the most are actually just going to continue to plod along in the same old way for the next few decades. And on that note, let me ask you guys a bit of a provocative question. If you had to imagine the world 45 years from now, where do you think there will be the least change? And what trendy prediction of the present do you think is destined to ultimately wind up as cringe-sounding as some of the stuff in here? Let me know in the comments, and I will see you next week.